Iran just announced something that every intelligence agency on the planet is now trying to verify. It said it targeted Netanyahu's office, not a radar installation, not a fuel depot, not a naval base somewhere in the Persian Gulf, the building where Israel's prime minister works, the address where the decisions that launched this war were made, and in the same strike package, the private residence of the commander of the Israeli Air Force, the man personally responsible for directing the most intense aerial campaign in the Middle East since the Second World War. Israel's response was silence, not a denial, not a confirmation, not a statement about Netanyahu's condition, his location, or whether the strikes came anywhere near him, the kind of silence that governments produce when the honest answer to a question is more dangerous than saying nothing at all. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Iran claimed to have hit, why Israel's silence is itself a data point, what this strike tells us about the strategic logic driving this conflict, and why the tension now building between Washington and Jerusalem may matter more than anything happening on the battlefield. Because the gap between what Iran says happened and what Israel is willing to confirm is where the real story of this war lives. Here is what we know. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps published a strike announcement identifying 2 specific targets in Tel Aviv. The first was the area containing Netanyahu's office, the prime ministerial command infrastructure from which Israel's wartime decision-making has been coordinated since February 28th. The second was the private residence of the Israeli Air Force commander, a serving senior military officer whose home address was apparently known to Iranian intelligence with enough precision to include it in a published targeting package. The IRGC announcement was specific. It named locations. It described the strike as deliberate and targeted. And it was released publicly, in the same format the IRGC has used to announce every previous wave of Operation True Promise 4, a format that has proven accurate often enough that Western intelligence agencies treat it as a primary source rather than propaganda. Israel confirmed sirens over Tel Aviv. Israel confirmed interceptions. Israel said nothing specific about what was targeted, what the missiles were aiming at, or what condition Netanyahu and the Air Force commander were in following the strike. In a conflict where both sides have been announcing successful strikes within minutes of execution, that a mission is not nothing. It is a decision. Someone in the Israeli government looked at the available information and concluded that silence was the correct response. That calculation is made for one of 2 reasons. Either the strike came close enough to something sensitive that confirming details would reveal vulnerabilities Israel cannot afford to expose, or the strike hit something that Israel is not yet prepared to acknowledge publicly because the acknowledgement itself would carry consequences neither the government nor the public is ready for. Both possibilities are alarming in different ways. Now consider what Iran was actually aiming at and why these 2 targets were selected together in the same strike package. Netanyahu's office is not simply an administrative address. During an active war, it is a command node. The Prime Minister's office in wartime functions as the political center of gravity for every military decision Israel makes. Targeting decisions that require political authorization flow through it. Diplomatic communications with Washington pass through it. The coordination between Israel's military leadership and its civilian government is managed from it. Destroying or disrupting that node does not just kill one person. It creates a structural gap in the decision-making chain at exactly the moment when decisions need to be made fastest. The Air Force commander's residence is a different kind of target. It is personal. It says something specific to every senior Israeli military officer currently directing operations. It says that Iran knows where you live. It says that the IRGC's intelligence penetration of Israeli personal security details is deep enough to include home addresses and published strike announcements. It says that the protection extended to serving commanders during peacetime does not extend to wartime. And it says all of this loudly, publicly, in a statement released to the world. That combination, the political leader and the military commander in the same strike package, is not a coincidence of targeting opportunity. It is a message about Iran's intelligence capabilities and its willingness to use them against individuals rather than institutions. This is what escalation looks like when it stops being about infrastructure and starts being about people. Now we need to talk about what is happening between Washington and Jerusalem, because the strategic tension developing between the 2 allies is the second story running underneath the strikes. And it may ultimately shape the outcome of this conflict more than any individual missile salvo. The United States entered this conflict with a defined objective and a defined timeline. Trump's public statements described a campaign of 4 to 5 days, later revised to 4 to 6 weeks, designed to degrade Iran's military capacity to the point where Tehran would have no choice but to negotiate. The American goal was always an end condition, a point at which military pressure had created sufficient leverage to bring Iran to the table on terms Washington could present as a victory. Israel's objective is structurally different. Israel does not want Iran at the table. Israel wants Iran's military capacity eliminated, permanently. The IDF has been working through a pre-built target list since the first night of Operation Epic Fury, returning to sites that survived initial strikes and completing their destruction. Netanyahu's public statements have referenced many more targets and an organized plan with many surprises. That is not the language of a government preparing for a negotiated exit. That is the language of a government that intends to keep fighting until there is nothing left to fight against. Those two objectives cannot coexist indefinitely. At some point, the gap between America's desire for a negotiated conclusion and Israel's drive for total military elimination of Iranian capacity will produce a decision point that neither government is publicly discussing, but both are privately managing. The signs of that tension are already visible. American officials have been careful to frame their involvement in terms of defensive necessity and support for an ally, rather than shared strategic ambition. The White House has distanced itself from some of Israel's more aggressive targeting choices. Pentagon statements have occasionally diverged from IDF characterizations of operational outcomes. These are small signals, but they are consistent signals. And in diplomacy, consistency of small signals is how large fractures announce themselves before they become visible. Iran is watching that gap and calculating how to widen it. The strikes on Netanyahu's office and the Air Force commander's residence serve a dual purpose. Against Israel, they are an attempt to decapitate or at least destabilize the command structure. Against the United States, they are a demonstration that Israel's leadership is personally exposed, that this war carries personal consequences for the individuals directing it, and that continued American support for Israel's maximalist objectives comes with costs that will be paid not just by soldiers and civilians, but by the officials making the decisions. That calculation is designed to pressure Washington into pushing Jerusalem toward restraint. Whether it works depends entirely on what the silence from Israel's government actually means. The global consequences of this uncertainty are already manifesting in numbers. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022, following the latest exchange of strikes. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed to Western shipping. More than 150 commercial vessels sit anchored outside the strait, unable to transit. Goldman Sachs has identified a $14 per barrel geopolitical risk premium embedded in current prices, and that assessment was made before Iran announced strikes on Netanyahu's office. Every intelligence service tracking this conflict is now running the same calculation. What happens to oil markets, to shipping insurance, to global supply chains, if the person directing Israel's response to Iranian strikes is suddenly absent from the decision-making chain? That question does not require Netanyahu to have been harmed to move markets. The uncertainty alone is sufficient, and Iran knows it. The IRGC has fired more than 500 ballistic missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since February 28th, 40% at Israeli targets, 60% at American positions across the region. 7 American service members are confirmed dead. Iranian ballistic missile attack rates are down 90% from day one levels, which means the system is degraded but not eliminated. And the strikes keep coming in ways that are increasingly personal, increasingly precise, and increasingly aimed at the humans making decisions rather than the hardware executing them. Here is what the silence from Jerusalem is telling you, whether Israeli officials intend it to or not. When a government confirms a strike, it controls the narrative. It shapes how the damage is understood, how the response is framed, and how allies and adversaries calculate what comes next. When a government goes silent, it surrenders narrative control. The information space fills with speculation, and speculation in an active war zone moves markets, shifts alliances, and changes the calculations of every actor watching from the outside. Israel chose silence after Iran announced strikes on Netanyahu's office and the Air Force commander's home. That choice was not made carelessly. It was not the default response of an overwhelmed press office. It was a deliberate decision by a government that concluded, in real time, that saying nothing was safer than saying anything. And the question that decision leaves hanging over this conflict is the one question that matters more than any other right now. Where is Netanyahu? What is his condition? And who is actually making Israel's decisions tonight? Iran says it knows the answer. Israel is not saying, and the world is watching the silence and drawing its own conclusions. Share this with everyone who needs to understand what is actually happening. Iran publicly named Netanyahu's office and the Israeli Air Force commander's private residence as strike targets. Israel confirmed sirens and interceptions, but said nothing about the specific targets or the condition of its leadership. The IRGC has demonstrated intelligence penetration deep enough to include personal home addresses in published targeting packages. Washington wants an exit. Jerusalem wants elimination. That gap is widening. Oil is above $100. The strait is closed. And the most important question in the Middle East right now is the one no official on either side is answering.